Hey, what's up guys? Alex here with a new video, and today we're doing a comparison that a lot of you have been asking for. Today we'll be comparing the Sony A7IV and the Canon EOS R6. If you're new to the channel, I am a portrait photographer based out of Orlando, Florida, and I am a former wedding photographer. I did weddings for 5 years and I retired last year. But for the last 4 years, I've been a Canon shooter. And what many don't know is I actually started my career with Sony cameras. I learned photography on the Sony A7IV and I just progressed through the lineup. Eventually, I had my problems and I switched to Canon. We'll get to that a little bit later. But here we are now in 2022 where both manufacturers have incredible cameras, and today we're looking at their entry-level options. On paper, they are similar but different, and I wanted to put it to the test. I do want to say I purchased both these cameras with my own money, and this video is not sponsored by anybody. In today's video, I'll be comparing both cameras, ergonomics, image quality, high ISO, but I also have a series of videos coming out in the next week or two where I'll be comparing the budget primes with each system. The Sony 35mm versus the Canon 35, the Sony 50 versus the Canon 50, the Sony 85 versus the Canon 85, because both systems offer great budget options to get your kit started, and I thought it'd be great to really go in depth with all these lenses. I am filming this video with a Sony A7 IV and Sony Cinetone, so you're getting an idea of the image quality. When you see the B-roll of the Sony camera, just know that that was shot with the Canon, and when you see B-roll of the Canon camera, just know it was shot with the Sony. This comparison is from a photographer's perspective, and I will not be covering any of the video features. With that said, let's get things started. Okay, let's get started with ergonomics. Here is why I left Sony. I am 6'4" and I have pretty large hands, and Sony cameras have always been on the smaller side. The last Sony camera I really shot with was the Sony A7IV, and at the time the grips were getting a little bit larger but were still too small for my hands. I had two issues. One, the grip was too close to the lens barrel, so my fingers would rub against the lenses. Two, the grip was too narrow, so after 4 or 5 hours of shooting a wedding, my hands would start to cramp, and it was just a horrible feeling. As you can see here with the Sony A7 IV, they've made the grip larger. It definitely fits the hand a lot better, but the grip is still too close to the lens barrel. Here with a Viltrox 35 1.8, which is a small lens, my fingers still almost rub against the lens barrel, which means if I'm using any G Master lens or any larger lens, my fingers will rub. One benefit of the Sony is definitely the customization. You have a lot more options to customize buttons and what you can do with them, and that is definitely a benefit if you want to make the camera your own. Looking at the Canon camera, to me this is the perfect grip. It's wide enough where my hands don't rub against the lenses, and that's important because Canon has some big lenses. It's got enough customization where I can customize the wheels and dials the way I wanted to, but it does have less buttons. So from an ergonomics perspective, to me the clear winner is Canon, but keep in mind I do have larger hands. If you have normal size hands or average size hands, I think it's going to be a toss-up on what feels better for you. This is truly a subjective area. But for me, ergonomics, the Canon takes the win. Continuing on with the body, here's where I really saw a big difference that I was not expecting. So the Sony has a 3-inch, 1.03 million dot display. That is pretty low resolution. When you compare it to the Canon has the same 3-inch display at 1.62 million dots. If you look at just specs, you'll think that the Canon just has a higher res screen, but I also found that the Canon has a more accurate display. When I was shooting images and comparing them, I noticed that the exposure on the Sony always looked brighter than the actual file. So if I was just going off the Sony display, I would be underexposing all my photos. That's not necessarily a big deal because the camera has incredible dynamic range, but it is kind of annoying that you can get an accurate readout just by looking at the display on the Sony. The Canon's a different story. The Canon's display is great in my opinion, and what you see is what you get. So you can easily get your exposure and nail it just by looking at the display. Also, the touchscreen functionality is a little different. So both cameras are touchscreen, but the Canon camera is just more responsive, and you can tell it was meant for touch. The Sony camera is still using the same type of display they've used for the last few years, where the touchscreen isn't as responsive or as intuitive, and again, just kind of takes you out of the experience. When you look at the EVFs, here's where they're more similar. The Sony has a 3.68 million dot EVF and it goes up to 120 frames per second, and the Canon has a 3.69 million dot EVF and it can also go up to 120 frames per second. And overall here, they're both not the best by any means, but they do the job. What really stood out to me here is the display, and I really did not like it one bit on the Sony, just because of the fact that if you can't nail exposure by looking at the display, that display is not good. And this is by far, I think, the biggest weak point in the Sony camera, because you're gonna see here, image quality and everything else about this camera is phenomenal, but this display is definitely a crutch. But let's move on. Let's talk about battery life. So when I was doing this comparison, I took both cameras out and I shot pictures of my wife. Here's some of the stats, and I'll put up pictures of the cameras after we were done shooting. On that day, we shot 484 photos with a Canon, and that put it at 76% battery life, so not bad. We shot 514 shots with the Sony, and it was at 81% battery life. My Canon R6 is about a year and a half old, so the battery isn't as new as the Sony. If you were to factor in a new R6 battery, I would say they are the same. So from a photography point of view, these cameras are going to give you the same type of battery life. These cameras also offer a battery grip where you can put 2 batteries, and that should last you for most of a wedding. I did find that when I was shooting with the R6, when I was doing weddings, I would roughly go around 2.5 batteries for an 8-hour day. Overall, I don't think there's any complaints here on the battery department, and they are both really, really good. All right, moving on to image quality. Here's where things get super interesting, because the Sony has a 33 megapixel sensor and the R6 has a 20 megapixel sensor, which means the Sony at the same price gives you 50% more megapixels. Does that mean better image quality? Well, let's take a look. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, and we're gonna compare some files to see if there is a big difference. Okay, so here we have the Sony file on the left, the Canon file on the right. All these files have been edited with my presets and have been edited to match each other. If you're interested in raw files, I will be providing them down below for you to play with, but I really wanted to compare these cameras the way I would deliver images to my client, because I don't deliver raw files. So let's take a look. You're gonna see initially here, these were both shot with a respective 35mm. There is not much difference in image quality. If I zoom in to 100%, you're gonna see that the Sony file on the left can obviously punch in a little more because you have more megapixels to play with, but from a sharpness and detail perspective, both files look really, really good. You're also gonna see that the Sony color science isn't as bad as people say it is. You can get it to match pretty closely with Canon, and it's not necessarily a big deal if you're shooting raw, at least in my opinion. But looking at these two images, both are gorgeous, both have tons of detail, don't really see too many differences. Let's take a look at another set. Here we have another set of images. Sony on the left again, Canon on the right, this time with the 85mm, and again, both images look very, very similar. Zooming in, of course, you're gonna see that you could punch in more with the Sony because of the megapixel count, but both files are very sharp. Both files have tons of detail, and I would deliver and love any of these files when it comes down to image quality. They both look great. Here we have another example, this time shot with the 50mm. Sony on the left, Canon on the right. There's gonna be lens differences, and we're gonna cover that in future videos, but strictly from an image quality perspective, they both look great. They were both shot with the same settings, dynamic range, colors. They both look really, really good. We're gonna let the Sony file render here. Of course, you could punch in more with the Sony, I keep saying that, but these files from a color perspective, dynamic range, you can see that shooting at base ISO, there is no noise in the background. Both images are really, really good. They both have the same settings. I tweaked the white balance to match as close as possible, but again, contrast, everything else is the same, and you can see here that, I mean, you really can't complain. Looking at dynamic range, here's where I thought we'd see a difference, because for the longest time, Sony has led the pack in dynamic range, so I figured this would be an easy win. Let's take a look at what happened. So as you can see here, these two files were shot 2 stops underexposed. On the left, we have the Sony, on the right, we have the Canon. If you zoom in, you can see these files are very underexposed. I did 2 stops because in the real world, I never go over 2 stops when I'm underexposing my images. I wanted to see if there was a difference. Let's take a look. So here we have both shots edited and shadows recovered, a full 2 stops, Sony on the left, Canon on the right. Zooming in, they are both extremely clean. You see some noise on the Sony here, a little less noise on the Canon, but again, we're punched in a little more. We have more megapixels. If we just slapped a little noise reduction, that would go away and we'd still get the same detail. That's the benefits of having more megapixels at your disposal. You can do a little more massaging to get the results you want, but they both have incredible dynamic range. Again, you can see here on the Sony, there is more noise in the shadows, which is crazy that the Canon is beating the Sony here in dynamic range, but you have a higher megapixel sensor, you can throw some noise reduction, you can definitely get them to match, but it's incredible when you're not zooming in at 100% and you're looking at it just 1-to-1, the image quality you're getting underexposing 2 stops is really, really good. Moving on, I wanted to also look at high ISO. So I shot both cameras at ISO 6400 to see what kind of results we would get. Let's take a look. Here we have the Sony on the left, Canon on the right. Both of these images were shot at ISO 6400. Let's go ahead and zoom in, and you're gonna see that at ISO 6400, both images still have great color, great detail. They do have noise, and you're gonna see here that the Canon with a lower megapixel sensor definitely takes a win here with high ISO. There is less noise in the background, but again, because you have more megapixels to play with the Sony, if you were to downsize it or throw a little noise reduction, you can get the same result. The Sony, by having 50% more megapixels, is still doing really, really good at ISO 6400, and you can see it, these images are very, very clean. They have 0 noise reduction. So that is really, really good, and the key to really getting good high ISO images is to overexpose the image. For example, when I slap my preset on my images, I find that I usually need to be about a stop over for it to look really, really good. It's not an issue when I'm shooting in normal daylight or low ISO because of the dynamic range. High ISO, you have to nail your exposure to get the least noise possible. As you can see here, I overexpose them a bit, so when I slap my preset on, the images still looked good. From an image quality perspective, is there a clear winner? I don't think so. First, I think Canon at 20 megapixels is still punching above its weight. Like 20 megapixels has been more than enough for me when using the R6. It's been more than enough when delivering wedding galleries and any type of session. The high ISO performance is really, really good. The small file sizes is definitely nice on your hard drive. And the Canon, I have 0 complaints on image quality from any perspective. The Sony really impressed me because, you always hear online, Sony color science is bad, Sony color science, Sony color science. As you can see here, if you're editing the raw images, you can get incredible colors out of the Sony. And Sony sensors are always just so far ahead when you look at dynamic range and high ISO. In this case, yes, it wasn't as good in high ISO or dynamic range, but you have 50% more megapixels. So you can get really close with just some tweaks and adjustments. I didn't do it here because I wanted it to be a fair comparison, but you can see how they're not that far apart. And it's really up to you to choose if you want to go with a higher megapixel count or a lower megapixel count and get those advantages. The big takeaway here is Canon has caught up with dynamic range, and it's no longer way behind the way it used to be. And both these cameras will produce incredible images. So I can't give the win to any of them because they're both really, really good. What about autofocus? Here's another one where Sony 3 years ago, 2 years ago, were so ahead of the pack with autofocus. Their IAF really changed the game, and Canon was really behind. They had terrible dynamic range and no IAF. From an autofocus perspective, both these cameras did a great job. I didn't really put them in challenging lighting situations. Even in the low light example, the cameras just found my wife's eye, and it was just so easy on both of them. I did a few walking shots where I tracked, and actually I can kind of play a sequence here so you can see. And in the walking sequence, the Sony did miss one image. Now that could have been the lens, it could have been a lot of factors, but when you really look at like the entire session, Sony to have missed one image, that is really kind of nothing in the grand scheme of things. So from an autofocus perspective, both these cameras were really, really good. And again, the takeaway is Canon's caught up. So they're neck to neck. So my final thoughts. I'm walking out of this comparison with a newfound appreciation for Sony and the cameras we have available today. You can see here, both these cameras are $24.99 retail. And they both have their pros and cons. We didn't even get to the video part because, I am a photographer, not a videographer. There is pros and cons to both cameras. But when you're looking at it from a photographer's perspective, strictly on image quality, both these cameras are very, very similar, and you can get incredible results with both these cameras. If you have any of these cameras in your hands, there is no reason why you can't deliver or create exceptional images. It's not the camera's fault at that point, it's all your fault. So we're at a point now where I think every manufacturer, their cameras are going to be so good, they're going to be more similar than not. And here's what I found with this comparison. Now it's going to get deeper though, because comparing these two cameras in a kind of the way we're doing it now, there are a lot of similarities, but when you really take a step back and look at the ecosystem, Canon and the RF glass I think is phenomenal, is still in its infancy. There's not that many lenses, and the lenses that are out there are very, very pricey. Sony's been doing this now for years, and their lens selection is incredible, and they have lenses available at every price point. That makes the Sony ecosystem so appealing because you can find any focal length from different manufacturers at different price points and really build your ultimate kit. So from a big picture ecosystem, Sony really has an advantage here because it fits every budget and you can find every focal length. Canon will get there, I hope, because I'm not sure they're going to allow Sigma, Tamron, and third-party manufacturers to make lenses the way Sony does. And if they don't, it'll be a shame because that's what makes the Sony ecosystem so special right now, is the availability and the flexibility of third-party lenses. And when you look at the big picture grand scheme of things, Sony really has a major advantage you cannot ignore. It's an advantage that's built over time. So we'll see how it unfolds in the future, but those are my thoughts. But what are your guys' thoughts? After looking at this comparison, is there really a Sony color science problem? Did the Canon 20 megapixels hold up with the Sony's 33? Like I said, I'm including files down below for you to download. They're raw files, play with them. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. And as always, guys, please like this video. Please subscribe to see the series of videos coming up comparing the budget lenses next to each other. And I'll see you on the next time. Have a good one, guys. Peace.